Hello and welcome to this special Frontline webinar on what's happening in West Asia. The developments of the past few days have really shocked and rocked the world. Uh, Apart from the open Israeli aggression on Iran, the continuing attacks on civilians and the deaths and murders of tens of thousands of civilians in Palestine are there for the world to see. The world is witnessing a silence and watching a genocide live on our screens of a kind which we've never seen before. In the middle of all this, we see Israel launching a war of aggression on Iran on the basis of very dubious intelligence, as has been proved time and again. In a sense, it reminded one of what happened with Iraq in 2003. After a lot of procrastination and hesitation on whether he will or he won't, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, the very unpredictable president of the United States, came into the war. And as David Hurst, the editor of Middle East Eye, put it, he was a one-shot wonder. It was a one-attack wonder. And in the midst of all his very interesting tweets, studied with all caps, when he spoke of regime change, and lo and behold, there was a change, and he talked of, thanked Iran for informing the United States and Qatar in advance on the strikes. So a lot has happened in West Asia. A lot will continue to happen, but we do have a ceasefire, and I'm sure ordinary people in both Iran and in Israel must be grateful for that ceasefire. But in the midst of all this, the daily killing of people in Gaza by Israeli aeroplanes at food distribution points is something which has really shocked the world. Today, I'm joined by two very eminent people who know and understand the region. I have with me Professor Kingshuk Chatterjee of the University of Calcutta. He's an expert on Iran. He has written a lot on this issue, and we are really happy to have his expertise on this special Frontline webinar today. And I'm also joined by Bashir Ali Abbas, a researcher, scholar, and a regular contributor to newspapers on the region. I'm going to begin with you, Bashir, today, and ask you, in the middle of all this, it appeared that the United States might go in for a long campaign with Iran, but suddenly we see Donald Trump calling for a ceasefire and virtually forcing the aeroplanes back, if news reports are to be believed, the Israeli airplanes that were out to bomb Iran. So tell us, Bashir, what changed and why this sudden ceasefire?
Thanks, Amit. It's a pleasure to be here for Frontline and talk to you and Professor Chatterjee on this very volatile set of developments in the Middle East. But again, in the last 20 months, I think the word unprecedented itself has been diluted. But to very succinctly answer your question, first things first, I think to clarify that when we begin, we are talking of the potentially long war between the United States and Iran, which seemingly abruptly stopped. But then the ceasefire announcement that the US president made was between Israel and Iran, which are third states vis-a-vis the United States that were fighting each other. So I just like to make this position clear that I've never believed that the United States would enter into a long, enduring, and sustainable war with Iran. In fact, we can get into the US-Iran nuclear negotiations itself later in the conversation. However, I believe that when the Israelis launched their strikes just before the sixth round of negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians, I believe that there was some degree of subversion involved, because the Israeli Prime Minister has made it exceedingly clear over the years that he's not in favor of any deal whatsoever, unless it's one which, in his words, is Libya style, where you can walk in and dismantle all of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, something that the United States has never really publicly supported. Now, in this case, when Trump finally decided to supplement Israel's effort in Iran, no matter the confusion in Israel's strategic objectives, when it launched this war, it became clear, and if you look at Arab media reports as well as other third-party reports, it became clear that this was also going to be choreographed, as has happened in the past between the United States and Iran. The US carried out a one-off strike, and it made sure that it communicated this to Iran as well. And again, by now, as enough expert analysis has shown, that Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities have definitely been hit, but it by no means has been hit enough for either Israel or the United States, insofar as some of Trump's tweets indicate. It is not sufficient to meet that maximalist objective that was set for a complete abolition of Iran's enrichment capability. In any case, without hitting the Bushehr reactor, this wouldn't have been possible either way. Coming to the ceasefire, then, I think the arrangement between the United States and Iran in a very reductivist way is rather clear. In January 2020, as well, once the United States killed Iran's arguably most famous general, there also we saw this choreographed action where Iran absolutely needs to save its own agency and face to preserve the credibility of its deterrence. But it also wishes to limit the impact of its attacks so that there's no inadvertent escalation or even deliberate escalation, but at least the conflict is contained. In this case, we saw that when Iran hit the Al Udeid base, or at least attempted to. It's the crown jewel of the United States military in the region. So we know the value that it would have had for the Iranian forces, but we also saw that it was thwarted.
Right, right.
Trump wasted no time at all in sort of announcing the ceasefire. And I'll just end with this, that
Yeah.
when it comes to the word ceasefire, whether between Iran and Israel or between Iran and the United States, just like how the words declaration of war is a little outdated, I think the word ceasefire is also a little outdated, because these conflicts are not fought according to conventional lines where you have a distinct cessation of hostilities that's signed with pen on paper. But more nuances on this later, perhaps, but I'll stop.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point that Bashir made, Professor Chatterjee, and ask you, this notion of ceasefire, I think that's a very interesting one, how long it will last, how long it will hold. But I want to ask you, what is your overall sense of the hostilities, especially between Israel and Iran? And what are the implications it has for the Iranian regime? Could you throw some light on that?
To start from the Israeli side, in course of the last year, both as a result of what has been unraveling in Gaza, as also the tit-for-tat strikes between Israel and Iran in April and October last year, Israeli defense policy seems to have been rewritten. So after the outrageous events of 7th October, Israel seems to have been looking for a military solution because it saw that a political solution was not likely to come. And having embarked on sort of downgrading the military capabilities of Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel was becoming a little more audacious in striking Iran in Syria a little more directly than it had ever done. But once the tit-for-tat strikes happened, it virtually shredded Israeli assumption that its military superiority would deter all direct attacks on it. And from that point, it seems that the desire of downgrading the military capabilities of any power, any organization, any country that could pose even a remote threat to Israel seems to have been worked upon. And the IDF was very clearly looking at all kinds of possibilities where it could sort of directly intervene to sort of downgrade the military capabilities. However, it also is coming out from chatter from Israel that while the IDF had prepared the plans, they were disapproving of the idea of going against Iran hammer and tongs in the manner Netanyahu started. This decision seems to have been a political decision. Some people are saying Netanyahu is doing this in order to keep himself relevant in Israeli politics and not have his obituary written immediately, political obituary written immediately. The other argument goes that this conflict, apart from addressing the strategic dimension, is also to be erected as a smoke screen for what's going on in Gaza. So you are looking at what's happening between Israel and Iran, high on media attention, relatively low in terms of human casualties. But in the last 12 days, more than 800 lives have been lost in Gaza, about which not many people are talking. So Israel has let's say there are two kinds of motivations that got the political and the military establishment in Israel behind the set of actions that you do. Iran, on the other hand, was reasonably certain that it did not want to get into any kind of conflict. Its agreement to get along with the idea of nuclear talks was itself an evidence that it did not want this kind of conflict. But once it happened, it had absolutely no other way of responding than to reciprocate. Once the conflict started the way it did, and the manner in which Israel played with Iranian aerial defenses, that made the Iranians realize that their preparedness was even less than what they thought out to be, because the missile strikes, while they managed to penetrate the Israeli aerial defenses, did not create that much impact, unless it was always orchestrated that way, which I doubt. So both sides were wary of letting this continue. Iran was running out of missiles and missile launchers without making any major dent on Israeli military capability. Israel, however, was running out of interceptors faster than they had anticipated. So Israel was not prepared for this kind of missile barrage effectively penetrating Israeli defense and without showing any signs of subsiding. So military logic in Israel for ceasefire was pretty strong. But I remain to be convinced that the political establishment would have settled just that happily right now had the military logic also not been compelling. The IDF is much less combative, it would seem, than the political establishment in Israel at the present time.
Right. So, what your sense is it your sense, Professor Chatterjee, that this is now more of a stalemate, and as you said, both sides were interested in the ceasefire, but isn't it for the first time that any country has managed to penetrate Israeli defenses and hit them where it hurts? And there's also information to suggest that there's been a complete news blackout that has been imposed by Israel. So we don't know exactly what has happened. So it's ironical that the country which calls itself the only democracy in West Asia or Middle East, we have less information about what happened there than we have in Iran. How do you see that?
This is pretty regular. In any case of conflict, truth is the first casualty. Information is the second. Misinformation is king in any conflict. So half the time you have any information coming out from official sources, it's most likely to be a tenth of what it actually is. And very few governments, democratic or otherwise, would let your foreign journalists who are not on your payroll gallivant around scenes of conflict. So this is pretty regular. Israel, of course, will not allow even release of videos or images which has not been vetted. But then that's something the states keep on doing. You do not actually have any freedom of information when it comes to times of war. You're absolutely right. We do not have any, except for what the government has released, any clear sense of Israeli casualties. So if both the sides' casualty figures given are correct, then Israel has killed around 500 Iranians, completely unwittingly, because Israel could not even find a Hamas command center, as it always does after every strike in Gaza. But it is at least claiming the hits of the IRGC functionaries. Iran, on the other hand, is not being acknowledged to have killed a lot, but whenever someone has died, it is always a civilian. So I would take the narrative in terms of casualties also with a degree of caution. This is, however, very clear that both the sides, when they went into the conflict in the manner that they did, they were not prepared for what was coming to them. Israel had, as you very correctly said, no clear sense of how much impact the ballistic missile barrages would have had. They thought with those three layers, Arrow, David Sling, and Iron Dome, they would have pretty much made short work of all Irani missile hits. That a few of them actually landed, which even they can't deny, clearly shows their effectiveness. Also, there was this fear that was being circulated within the Israeli establishment that we are running out of interceptors. Please note, This is the military establishment that was telling you these things, not the political one. The political one remained gung-ho. So the assumption that it always seems from outside that Israel, just like what Iran seems to the Americans, that Israel also is a monolith, neither of these two countries are monolith. So the Israeli military was wary about going in, and it was keen on getting out, because when the Iranian barrages began, they understood that they were not equipped to handle this in the medium term, because they had no reason to be prepared for a sustained thing. The longest Israelis have been assaulted by either Hezbollah or Hamas, none of their drone or missile or rocket capabilities come close to Iran's. So, however much you may anticipate a conflict with Iran, simply because there is actually no casus belli for Iran, they do not have any shared territory, they do not have any territorial disputes. There are no real disputes. Why would anyone risk a war? That has actually influenced both Iranian and Israeli defense thinking towards each other. Iranian military capability was geared towards American attack, not one that would ward it off, but one would that lessen the blow, soften the impact. Israeli military capability was with Hamas and Hezbollah in mind. Iran is there at the back of their mind, but the likelihood of a conflict emerging was very slim.
Professor Chatterjee, I want to just hold that thought. I want to bring Bashir in here also.
Sure.
Bashir, I want to ask you one thing. We've seen the horrific daily killings happening in Gaza of Palestinians. The question that I want to pose to you is the following. With what has happened in Gaza and the fact that there is a warrant out for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, is it now a situation where Netanyahu can no longer survive as a quote-unquote peacetime leader? He needs war to perpetuate his own personal survival. I want to ask you, what do you think on this?
Amit, I think that question has been answered by Netanyahu himself. Both Netanyahu as well as the members of his cabinet. From the time that Israel's war on Gaza started, and again, war for the lack of a better term, you have had multiple attempts in the Israeli system, both within its polity as well as its judicial system, to either limit Netanyahu's power or to remove him from government entirely. Let's not forget that for the past few years, Netanyahu is a part of an active trial for breach of trust, for fraud, for corruption. And in December last year, he became one of the, I think, if not the first Israeli prime minister to sort of stand in the dock in a criminal trial in his own defense. But in this case, whenever an attempt has been made to question Netanyahu's cabinet's powers and the kind of decisions that it undertakes, the government logic has always been that while the war is on, it is going to be irrational or rather unwise to attempt whatever the opposition might be doing. And we have invariably seen that once the Israeli government carries out any such action, which was earlier contested by the opposition, is then sort of retroactively justified by people across the board. Even now, just before the June 13 strikes that Israel began, the 12-day war, as is now being called, the day before Israel struck Iran, saw an attempt in the Israeli parliament to sort of dissolve the parliament and call for early elections. Now, this again can't happen for about another 6 months, but even then, members of Netanyahu's cabinet right after the vote, just like they had been saying for the war with Gaza, now said that, look, we have an active threat with the Iranians in the midst of this clash with the Iranians, which again is historic for both Israel as well as Iran. It is going to be unwise to attempt something like this. To illustrate this a little further, Yair Lapid, arguably the principal opposition figure in the Israeli parliament today, first criticized the government after the vote, saying that this can't last, it's not sustainable, and Netanyahu's government will fall. However, once the Israeli strikes were carried out, you also had Yair Lapid in support of Netanyahu's actions against Iran. And this is a dichotomy that we've seen in Israel time and again, where protests against Netanyahu's ways of functioning, including his allied political parties, which now include far-right Orthodox parties as well, questioning that is distinct from questioning the larger strategy that Israel follows towards either the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, or say against Iran, right? I think that dichotomy is important to consider here. Lastly, in this case, just today morning for us here in India, I think Trump stepped in and said that Netanyahu's trial is a terrible idea because he and I have gone through hell, in Trump's words, in sort of dealing with this whole situation in Iran. That is significant because in the last 24 hours, at least, we saw Trump berate the Israelis publicly in ways that he had never done before. And mind you, this is Israel's best friend in the White House, in Netanyahu's own words. There were a lot of similar questions that were being asked. That is there a new gap in this relationship between Tel Aviv and Washington, right? Certainly between the Trump White House and Bibi's government. This, however, I think slightly changes that. Right? If Trump himself, in some ways, is interested in securing Netanyahu's personal and political position, then that changes the game. Right? But thus far, to answer your question very simply, it's been very clear that Netanyahu, whether he can be a peacetime president or not, is another matter. Because in the past, he's shown that he can be. But in the last 20 months, it's been clear that his preference, however, is to be a wartime president because it makes
Right.
it easy for him to sort of divert attention from a lot of issues, not just internal but external in Gaza as well. So internally, both from trial and externally from is the idea of sanctions in Gaza.
Right. Kingshuk, I want to bring you in here. I mean, the policies that we've seen, Israel and the US acting in concert, and you know what Bashir was saying earlier about the differences between Tel Aviv and Washington. We seem to have gleaned some of that earlier, though Trump has been far more public now. But in the end, it seemed that they were acting in concert, and maybe this was some play acting, because clearly Trump enjoys the game of play acting. The question I want to ask to you is that the reports that we are seeing, news reports, is that a lot of Iranians have rallied, critics of the government also, they have rallied around the regime or the Iranian nation, if I might put it like that. Do you think that this joint Israeli-American aggression on Iran, on the grounds of denying Iran this so-called nuclear weapon, which we have not seen any evidence of, is it your case this is going to push Iran to building an actual nuclear weapon? What is your sense?
Let me just dial back a little to what Bashir was saying, and then I'll come to this
Sure.
part. It is very tempting to conclude that this is all Netanyahu and Trump. This is neither Netanyahu alone nor Trump alone. Okay, Netanyahu, in fact, has been the single biggest block to the two-state solution from the time of Oslo Accords. He has purposefully short-circuited this. He has purposefully kept the Hamas and Fatah warring with each other so that the Palestinians cannot work as a single people, so that the second state, meaning the Palestinian state, can be denied. But this is not just Netanyahu. In a government that has Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, instead of Netanyahu, had it been Yair Lapid, forget Lapid, had it even been Ehud Barak, it would have been very difficult to do otherwise, because there is one part of the question that is never generally addressed, is that if you look at the demographics of the Israeli scenario, you have 9 million citizens, of whom 7 million are Jews, 2 are Arabs, but 5 million who are living in occupied Palestine, in Gaza and West Bank. Put them together, you have 7 million people of Jewish descent and 7 million people of Arab descent. So far as the Israeli society and state are concerned, their very existence seems to be threatened by them, because by now they have been talking about it for almost 20 years. By now they are convinced that there is no political solution to the conflict. So even if you remove Netanyahu, after 7th October 2023, it would take a very brave Israeli leader to go and talk to the Palestinians for a second state in that land. So Gaza and West Bank would fester some more, and it would keep itself on the front ranks of world problems. To bring in Trump, Trump began as an isolationist, but at the time of the Iran strikes, it seems that the Republican neocon lobby got through to him, with which he has kind of an inveterate dislike. But at one point, he thought maybe this will work. He went in. Only later to have it dialed back to him. People were saying the reason why we did not go for those military strikes in 2015 and went for the JCPOA was we were reasonably certain that it would not yield the results you are talking about, which it has turned out to be the case. About the Iranian thing, I am reasonably suspicious that the Iranian establishment, even though they have failed miserably in protecting themselves and the nation from the Israeli attacks, would now use that very thing, their inability to argue that without a nuclear solution, we cannot have any security. That argument would gain the ground. On the other hand, however, the mere fact that the protagonists of the nuclear option have failed miserably in providing national security, they have also lost much of the argument as protagonists of national security. So the hardliners may lose, but it is very difficult to see how an argument against a nuclear deterrent would win readily.
But we haven't seen, Professor Chatterjee, we haven't seen, one of the things that I possibly thought is that Iran would announce a pullout from the NPT. They haven't done that.
They might. That is their
biggest
might.
But what I'm saying is that
please understand something. In Iran, for the last 25 years or nearly 25 years, there has been an unspoken consensus. Unspoken in the sense it has not come out in the public media in any way. That there has been an unspoken consensus that having seen how close Saddam had come to going for WMD, Iran would develop a nuclear capability. Now, the division was on this question, whether it would actually build the weapons and risk further economic isolation or stop at the threshold, not cross it. But that Iran should have the nuclear capability, which it could eventually weaponize on later if required, if pressed to the wall. There is no doubt about that. You speak about it when it's about Iran. You don't speak about it with reference to Japan. But Japan has the same thing. Japan is developing nuclear capability, but Japan is not talking of crossing the threshold. And because Japan is in the American camp, it is not causing any problem. Now, that is a very reasonable position to take if you are in a neighborhood.
My question to you, Kingshuk, is this. If they had the bomb, you see, it's also, I lived and worked.
They don't. I agree with you.
I'm saying assumption. I lived in Pakistan. I was there when the nuclear tests happened. Those 17 days from the 11th of May, 1998 to the 28th of May when the Pakistanis tested, they had to test, apart from showing the capability, to convince their own people that they had the bomb. It was very important because between India and Pakistan, as they say, mooch ka sawal hai. So Precisely. The point I'm making is, it may be a slightly unfair question to ask, but if I'm saying if the Iranians had that capability, would they come out in the open?
They, unlike the Israeli establishment, they probably would want to come out in the open, except that the sanctions regime being what it is, if they would actually come out in the open, it would become even killer kind of regime. And that is what we loosely call the reformists to the left of the Iranian establishment. These people are bent on avoiding, because they want to bring Iran back to the international economic fold. And that is the reason why there is that division right down the middle. There are the hardliners who want to get the bomb regardless of what the consequences are. On the other hand, you have the reformists who say, let us have the capability, but do not weaponize it. And there are the pragmatists in the middle who hold the balance. By and large, they have till now spoken of capability without weaponizing. That is the bit that might change, but that would have also a hell lot of consequences to pay. So
very quickly, I want to ask you, Kingshuk, I want to ask you very quickly. the events of this 12-day war, as Trump called it, have changed a lot of things. What changes for Iran? What changes for Iran? If you were to say like one, two, three things, what changes for Iran?
That's a very difficult thing. One is the regime and its national security claim has taken a hit. So the legitimacy of the hardliners in the establishment, they have failed to deliver, to justify. So their legitimacy in the entire logic has taken a hit. On the other hand, those who were willing to negotiate with America, they also have a very difficult case to answer. So no one has actually turned out to be the winner in this case. Iran is in for a longer haul, going through a sort of kind of cycle of change. This in itself would neither be critical nor decisive, but it would be very important. Some of the things that can be useful are the people who have replaced those hardline figures who have been bumped off by the Israelis. But on the whole, the one thing that remains absolutely clear is that till now, Iran and Israel did not really have any real substantive ground for enmity. Iran's posturing against Israel was mostly tactical. Its support for Hamas and Hezbollah had been tactical. Now Iran has a casus belli against Israel. So this ceasefire, it's like a truce at best, nowhere close to a peace.
Just hold that thought, Professor Chatterjee. I want to bring in Bashir. Bashir, this whole thing started with the horrific attacks by Hamas, and then we saw the absolutely brazen assault on defenseless Palestinians in Gaza. And this continues even as we speak. They're being starved, they're being bombed, all kinds of horrific things are being done. So the absolute silence of the Arab regimes and their inability, if there's anyone who's done anything, it's Iran in whatever, little way they have, hit Israel and made it hurt. So what happens to the Palestinians now? Does this help them in any way in their own struggle for statehood? Does it mean that their conditions may improve? Does it mean that there could be a ceasefire? What happens to them?
You mean the result of the current Iran?
No, I mean, what? Yeah, I mean, does all this have any bearing on the state of affairs for the Palestinians themselves? Because the campaign of bombing is not stopping. The whole world, whether it's the US, it's the Gulf regimes, nobody is able to stop the Israelis. So I'm saying, does this conflict have any bearing at all on the state of affairs of the Palestinian people?
Amit, I would argue, insofar as influencing Israel's actions in Gaza goes, I would say no effect at all. Right? I think in the past as well, Israel has shown this capability, regardless of intent and regardless of what the costs are, this capability to keep pushing. Right? I would go one step further and argue that, in fact, this new conflict with Iran that Israel initiated allowed it substantially to divert international focus away from Palestine. Because let's not forget, up until June 12th, in those 2 weeks before that, you perhaps saw unprecedented and concerted European criticism of Israel that had only been sporadic in the past. A lot of it was triggered by the fact that Israel, especially since March this year, has effectively prevented any humanitarian aid from flowing through. It's only recently that it's allowed a trickle. Israel has preferred to send in aid through its own Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which the UN Secretary General has himself said is not compatible with international law given its heavily militarized approach, right? You had a joint statement by United Kingdom, France, and Canada coming out and saying that they remain committed to supporting a Palestinian state, calling Israel's new Gaza operation, which it launched in May this year, right? Let's not forget, this was just when you had the rumblings of US-Iran negotiations picking up again. Israel launched Operation Gideon's Chariot in Gaza, which had markedly different, or at least publicly stated, objectives to capture and hold territory in Gaza. Right. All this while, we have had, to put it rather simplistically, at least some rift between the military establishment and the political establishment in Israel vis-a-vis the day after in Gaza, right? But that rift has not manifested enough to put any halt on the degree to which Israel carries on. So when this new operation started, this has an even more expansive objective, which is to hold territory. I think after Ariel Sharon sort of withdrew Israel from the Gaza Strip, including settlements, and just for your viewers, that's the time when Netanyahu also quit Sharon's cabinet in protest. We don't know if that is something that's going to happen again, because simultaneously, parallel to Israel's actions in Gaza, Israeli settlements in the West Bank, or at least Israel's intentions to expand settlements in the West Bank, have also grown, right? You also, since the professor also mentioned Bezalel Smotrich as well as Itamar Ben-Gvir, who have now rejoined. Ben-Gvir himself had quit Netanyahu's coalition, but now he rejoined Netanyahu's cabinet. These two individuals are now under unprecedented sanctions, especially from the United Kingdom. So again, before June 12th, if I remember correctly, Saudi Arabia and France were going to co-host a UN conference to recognize a Palestinian state, right? All of that went out of the global eye in one day, right? So if anything, I think Israel always had this sort of impunity that it believes it has when it comes to killing the Palestinians. But if anything, I would say that impunity only increased when the conflict with Iran was on. Now you have Trump coming out and saying again, based on what Steve Witkoff, his negotiator for the Middle East, has told him, that there's progress again on a ceasefire in Gaza. But I personally wouldn't put too much stock by it, because it was Trump himself who rather successfully initially implemented a three-phase ceasefire in late January. But we couldn't even get through phase one of that ceasefire because, again, it blew up in Trump's face. But
Right.
that was forgotten, that was glossed over. We're just in a cyclical loop that continues. I think it's very difficult. I think we reach analytical saturation
Right.
insofar as Israel's actions in Gaza go.
I want to pick up on a point that Bashir made, Kingshuk. The notion of impunity. I know we are always looking at events, but why don't you explain to our frontline webinar viewers, why does Israel enjoy this impunity? Can you put this in some context for us?
I doubt anyone ever would be able to do it to any satisfaction. To argue in terms of American special relationship with Israel will not come close to it. To talk about Western indifference to Arab lives, Muslim lives in Palestine would have absolutely no resonance. The one thing that might actually come close to satisfying answer is an answer that is rarely stated. That there is a sense of guilt which influences Western decision of not criticizing Israel beyond the point that Israel needs to, that Israel actually builds on. So, the previous German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, when, in Europe, there are a lot of critical voices to what Israel is doing to Palestine, but none of the governments are making the kind of, or exerting the kind of pressure on Israel that they could, simply because the optics of it, that these are, because this would be the Israeli counter-narrative, that these are the very people who had embarked on that Holocaust, which made the creation of Israel a necessity. See, anti-Semitism, the moment you start opposing Israel, you are branded an anti-Semitic person. Anti-Semitism is a peculiarly Western phenomenon. It never existed anywhere in Asia. But the moment you oppose Israel, the Israelis simply conflate that as a kind of racism, as a kind of anti-Semitism that they are victims of. So the Israelis, in their own narrative, which they have successfully broadcast elsewhere, is that the Israelis are victims of the situation, which they are. I do not dispute of Israeli victimhood in the hands of European anti-Semites in the first half of the 20th century. The problem is being victims of victims is no different. And that
on the same thing, does this guilt extend to acquiescing to the slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians?
Who is going to fight for the Palestinian? Poor Gaza or West Bank, they do not even have oil. Why would you use the taxpayers' money to save lives that are not ours to save? That becomes a very persuasive argument in many capitals. How many Arab capitals have you seen fighting for Palestinians? Please remember when the Arabs did fight for the Palestinians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, these are all people who were afflicted with the problem of Palestinian refugees, Palestinians who were being driven out of Israel, Palestine, the territory, and they were simply trying to push their brothers back to their own houses so that the burden of Palestinian refugees is not taken. How many shots have Saudi soldiers fired against Israel ever? The count is zero, because the Saudis did not ever have a Palestinian problem. Only those who had a refugee-related problem had fought. And now that first-generation refugees, those have become absorbed in the Arab populations. So those who are in Gaza and in West Bank, as long as they're in Gaza and West Bank, they're still Israel's problem. And for Israel, it's not a very easy problem, because as I was saying, in what used to be historic Palestine, today you have 7 million Arabs and 7 million Jews. If you have a democratic establishment, then in 10 years, the Arabs would outnumber the Jews. So the Jewish people of Israel would not want a one-state solution. You make it a two-state solution, what would be the territory like? Right from 1937, whenever Palestine was being considered for partition, the impossibility of the task stared at the face of everyone. So Israel has an impunity simply because nobody has an interest. I'm being a little harsh, a little cruel, and a little cynical. But Israel has the impunity because it is in no one's interest to intervene in Palestine.
So I just want to ask you very briefly before I go to Bashir, are we seeing, we've seen colonialism, then we have the term neo-colonialism. I mean, are we seeing, this colonial approach? Is that what we are seeing, towards the Palestinians and in other parts of the world? I mean, the Americans have bombed some 8 or 9 Islamic countries in the last few years. I mean, is that what we are seeing? Is this aerial bombing colonialism?
With reference to Palestine, let's see, put it this way. If you ask a Palestinian, it's very clear. Israeli is a settler colonial state. These are people who have come from outside the region, settled down, and they are grabbing all the lands. If, however, you were born in independent Israel, the category you call the Sabra, not the Yusuf, the Sabra, if there is to be no Israel, where would those people go? Their antecedents may have come from Eastern Europe, they may have come from Russia, they may have come from Germany, France, whatever, victims of Holocaust. But those who were born in Palestine, either before 48 or after, and have seen no land other than Israel, where would they go?
Right.
So an ideal solution, which was the closest we have ever come to it, was the Oslo peace process.
Right.
That is where you share the land. Now, the thing is, the Israeli state of the 1980s realized that you cannot have a military solution where a subject population has approximately 40% of the total population strength of the state. That is when the Oslo peace process took place. And I'm trying to emphasize this repeatedly, that right now the demographic balance is 50-50.
Okay.
So the last time you had a political solution tried, at that point of time, the Jews had a numeric advantage in demographic terms. Today, they have lost that advantage, which is the reason why the Jewish component of Israel is fighting harder than ever before. And it is not likely to get easier anytime soon.
So I'm going to bring Bashir in now. And I'm going to ask him now about the Indian position on whatever is going on. The absolute silence of our government, though they have joined some BRICS statement today, I read in the newspapers. What is the reason for this absolute silence? After all, India had long supported the Palestinian cause, and we have been, humming and hawing and, using all the terms. Our Prime Minister traveled abroad, but he never said a single word on all these issues as far as Palestinians are concerned. So you follow, what the Ministry of External Affairs and others say carefully as an analyst based in Delhi. How do you see the Indian position?
Amit, I will be taking that question, but if you'll allow me just a minute to
Sure,
also
please. Yeah.
jump in on the previous discussion.
Briefly, please, because we are now running out of time. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the fact that we have not really seen any punitive measures whatsoever taken against Israel by the Arab states or most other states in the world. Until you have any punitive measures whatsoever, any condemnation will only be an expression of intent, but not capability. The Arab armies have fought Israel in the past and they've performed horrendously, and there also I'm putting it mildly, right? But in this case, today you have new leadership in the Arab world. The Arab world also is no longer the kind of the cohesion of the pan-Arabism of the kind of Nasser or even in the decades after that. Each state is guided by its own interests, but most of all, especially with leaders like MBZ in UAE and MBS in Saudi Arabia, they want the conflict to end. Let's be very clear there, right? Because their interest is the protection and the consolidation of their own powers within their own state, and they do not like any threat whatsoever to that state authority, whether from radical elements or otherwise, right? And their diversification, their economic diversification focus, along with the intention to bring in as much Western investment into the region as possible, is not helped by a conflict of this kind. That
Right.
having been said, their capabilities to end this is miserably poor, miserably little, right? Because the military element of it is far more advanced. We can begin by talking of the economic aspect of it all. Just look at the states that are still party to the Abraham Accords. They still don't have any incentive whatsoever to exit that arrangement. But you could argue that that relationship has been strained. But I would say that there has been a lack of ideas about how to tackle core questions when it comes to the conflict.
Right.
I'll just stop with one factoid here is in the last 20 months, the Arabs have also repeatedly, and I would argue in good faith, tried to present several plans for one, to cease hostilities in Gaza, and second, for a Jews post-bellum setup where you can look towards reconstruction. But they have always skirted around one question, which is that of Hamas. This is a question that has plagued the world, even say back in the mid 2000s when Hamas won the elections in Gaza and the world didn't know whether you reconcile your need for respecting Palestinian democratic expression with reconciling it with accepting an actor that you have
Right.
deemed terrorist. We still don't have an answer to that, and clearly neither do the Arab states. And I don't really fault them for it because we don't have consensus on how to tackle this
Right.
question.
Yeah.
But that having been said, coming to the Indian position, I've told this elsewhere as well. I think it's not that India has been silent, right? I think India has said what it needs to say, but it has been characteristically insufficient insofar as the peculiar dynamics of the Israel-Palestine conflict is concerned. And just for your viewers, I'd like to point
No,
this out.
I'm not just talking about. I'm not just talking about Israel and Iran. I'm talking about the
I'm no,
Palestinians.
I'm
Yeah.
only talking of Israel Palestine. The Israel Iran conflict is an entirely different matter, insofar as the Indian position is concerned. And I would like to point this out to your viewers because this is constantly forgotten underneath all of the noise on Twitter and elsewhere. Is that in the last 11 years, if you look at India's voting record at the United Nations General Assembly, towards the end of every year, the UNGA, especially in its plenary sessions, takes up a set of recurring resolutions on Palestine. These have to do with Palestinian sovereignty, the Palestinian right
Yeah.
of
So
self-determination.
we vote differently on occasion. But what I'm
No,
saying is
no,
that our
we don't.
heart is not there, Bashir. Our heart is not with the Palestinians. This government's heart
Absolutely.
is not with it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But let me just build
Yeah.
towards that position. And I sort of point this out to show you a kind of division that's sort of coming out today. And to continue where I left off, in the last 11 years, when it comes to all of these resolutions on Palestinian rights, India votes in favor. It doesn't abstain. As we saw in the Russian Ukraine case, India could very well change the position to one of abstentions. It would never vote against. But you abstain to maximize your room to maneuver. But in this case, India continued and continues to vote in favor of the Palestinian case and against Israel at the UN. We also saw last year where our foreign minister at several points in time brought up the need for a two-state solution as the only sustainable path forward. And this is the point which I've been trying to build. What happened most recently? We saw that India abstained on yet another ceasefire at the UNGA, an attempt towards a ceasefire in Gaza, where India abstained, unfortunately, standing out from the global south. Technically, very strictly technically, the Indian position was consistent with its need that any such resolution should not refer to the International Court of Justice, because India believes that any solution has to be negotiated with all stakeholders, including the Israelis and the Palestinians, of course, without any such external punitive element. In December in 2023, when we voted in favor of it, that resolution didn't have any such references. This one did. But the question I have asked is, what is more valuable to us, that technical consistency or the need to stand with the global south, as well as the need to defend a position that India has consistently stood by?
Absolutely. The simple question, forget the UN for a moment, Bashir.
Yeah.
Has the government of India issued any statement condemning the death of Palestinian citizens in a standalone statement?
No, it has
That's
not.
a simple question.
No, it has not. It has not done that, right? But this is the kind of point that I'm trying to make, that
right.
We have also not done this in the past for any other conflict, right? We have issued stronger statements elsewhere, but the Indian priority always is to maximize its own choice. Right? But this is the argument that I also push.
As you were referring to the UNGA, we stood out with some really dubious countries when we abstained on that resolution.
Just allow me to make one last point. Sure. Having said all of this, my question is, when I talk of the political value of the current Indian position, I would say that we are now at a point where not undertaking any sort of punitive language or critical language against Israel also harms our interests now, because one, as I said, the Israeli action of physically removing the actual facts on the ground, right? The facts on the ground is the real heart of the matter when it comes to Palestine. The continual fait accompli that Israel continues to impose, one, goes against a position that India has consistently defended, which necessarily demands a more proactive set of actions on India's part. That's one. Secondly, beyond the intellectual stuff, beyond the rhetorical stuff, which is condemnation or lack of condemnation, what is the actual effect on the ground? In September 2023, India embarked on a rather ambitious and unprecedented connectivity project known as the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor.
Right.
It is evident now that Israel's continuing war without any achievable strategic objective whatsoever is at the heart of all of the obstacles to this corridor. Without that, no matter what effort you put in at any other point in the corridor, it is not going to proceed. And we also know that it is in the regional interest, the Arab interest, with whom we have partnered immensely in the last few years, also want the conflict to end. So it is appearing that it's not, if you see that these regions are coming closer to each other, it's this one continual source of conflict that prevents progress on these substantial developmental efforts. For India, which is in a leading position for a lot of these efforts and initiatives, it is at this point not just a recommendation, it is a necessity that you play a more proactive role to end this conflict, and you cannot do that without bringing your influence to bear on a relationship that you proudly say you have cultivated in the past few years, and that is Israel.
Right. I'm going to bring in Professor Chatterjee from his perch in Kolkata. How do you see New Delhi's position from your perch?
You want to shut down?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so a couple of things. First is, of course, there is a split, shall we say, in the government of India between the political establishment and the diplomatic establishment. Now, I cannot reveal my sources, as all journalists begin by saying, I'm told.
You're wearing our hat now.
Yeah, exactly. That is how I stay safe. The argument goes that the political establishment considers it essential to align closely with Tel Aviv because they say that the relations have improved to the point that in Pahalgam they had stood resolutely in India's corner. So we have to reciprocate. The diplomatic establishment wants to balance this thing as we always have done. So even when we were getting closer to Israel, friends should be able to criticize when other friends are going wrong. So, and believe me, from the little that I know of Israeli diplomatic thinking, the Israelis know that in most cases, even their closest friends will end up criticizing them, and they don't hold it against the friends. If you are more eager to please Israel than Israel needs to be, then you are asking for it. You are asking for the opprobrium we're getting. The good thing is the government of India, and more importantly, the people of India, enjoy a kind of goodwill among Palestinians that, regardless of what the optics would be, India would always have leverage on both sides of the conflict.
And we saw this statement from the Iranian embassy in Delhi yesterday, which ended with Jai Iran and Jai Hind.
This is the bit. The Indian diplomatic establishment has successfully cultivated goodwill on all sides of almost all conflicts. So if only India would be willing to be a little bold, it would prevail.
Exactly.
We do not have the heft that the United States has and the China has. But go and speak to an average Palestinian in the streets of Jerusalem, Ramallah, Gaza. China does not have any resonance. India does. India always did. And we could easily be the brokers of peace in just about every single, so when IMEC was being discussed, I thought that India is actually finally playing a winning card. It is a fascinating possibility. You bring the Arabs and the Israelis come closer together. You might even build bridges across the two sides of the Gulf. India has that reservoir of goodwill. For some reason, it's this P.G. Woodhouse phrase, do you let I dare not wait upon I would? You may want to do something, or you may fear that if you try it, you would lose a lot. Only when we sort of overcome our fear and try, we may fail. How does it matter? We are not getting anything with our silence. We are not getting any brownie points. Stand by both sides, see if a fair deal can be worked out, and who knows, you may reap the benefits. But for some reason, this does not get across to the Indian establishment. Being in my perch in Bengal, I'm safer to make this argument. I hope Bashir, despite being in Delhi, would push the same case.
Right. So the other point that I wanted to ask you very quickly, this evolving Indian position and this lack of sort of initiative to get into conflict situations. Bashir, what do you think? What is the reason for this Indian diffidence?
We have a very strong aversion to risk across the board. It doesn't matter where the conflict is. It doesn't matter what the character or scale of the conflict is, right? We continue to be risk averse even in bilateral situations, right? Look, we are in a world where, given the language of interest, and firstly, I usually disagree with all those who distinguish the moral argument from the interest-based argument. Those two are not divorced from each other by any means. But that having been said, despite the sort of dissonance with international law and norms and all of that, just look at how India phrases its defense of its actions against Pakistan. It takes great care to insert language that it knows is in compliance with norms that have evolved over the decades, and to show that India is a responsible actor, right? But within all of that, no matter the sort of great noise that is generated as whenever we have clashes with Pakistan, and certainly after a seemingly abrupt ceasefire, which to my mind was not that abrupt at all, it's only because that risk aversion continues. Because like a lot of the other states, and not so dissimilar from the Arab states as well, our interest presently is also economic growth and a certain developmental objective that we have set for ourselves. It's another matter that there are a number of challenges to face even in that objective, but that's internal. When it comes to the external position, we saw in the Russia-Ukraine case first, the extent to which we sort of, the risks we took to defend that risk-averse position, right? I think this
Right.
is something that
I
has
think
sort of,
that's a good takeaway. I'm
yeah,
afraid we're running
that
out
sort
of.
of entrenched itself in our strategic thought. I'll just stop there.
I'm afraid the 1 hour allotted to our webinar is, coming to an end. But I don't want to leave. I mean, we'll discuss India another day, more. But I just want to bring the focus back on the takeaways from this discussion, that how volatile a situation is, the impunity that Israel continues to enjoy, and the fact that the world is at threat. Not just, we didn't even speak of the number of Indians living in the Gulf and how it may impact them. We never got into that, and perhaps that's all for the good. But the overall impact, the continued allowance given to Israel to indulge in impunity, in impune aggressions against sovereign countries. I think that is something which concerns all of us. And I hope I'm speaking for the two of you all, as well, that at least the aggression has ended, the hostilities have ceased, and people can perhaps go about their
Only
business
in Iran.
Only in
Only
Iran,
Only in Iran.
not in
Not in
Palestine.
Gaza.
Certainly
In
not.
Gaza, it will continue.
Right.
Unfortunately,
I was talking about, but I'm glad you brought in the Palestinian state of the Palestinians again. So thank you very much, Bashir Ali Abbas, research scholar, journalist, writer on strategic affairs, for joining us, and Professor Kingshuk Chatterjee with his unique perspective from Kolkata. Thank you for joining this Frontline webinar, and I'd like to thank all of you who've been watching and listening to our discussion.
thanks for having us.
Thank you, Amit. Great conversation.
Thank you.